From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Do you accept that ultimately you are responsible for this whole fiasco?
No.
You're not responsible. Who is responsible?
The people that I trusted to run it, and then maybe the people they trusted.
Can you name
I
people?
worked with Mr. Hinton for 52 years, and I would trust him with my life.
I am not responsible. So testified Rupert Murdoch yesterday in an unprecedented hearing with his son James Murdoch in the British Parliament about the phone hacking scandal. Today in Parliament, the British Prime Minister is fiercely grilled by the opposition leader Ed Miliband about why Cameron hired former News of the World editor Andy Coulson as his chief spokesperson. Coulson has since been arrested.
He says that in hindsight, he made a mistake by hiring Mr. Coulson. He says that if Mr. Coulson lied to him, he would apologise. Mr. Speaker, that isn't good enough. Because people, it's not about hindsight, Mr. Speaker. It's not about whether Mr. Coulson lied to him. It is about all the information and warnings that the Prime Minister ignored.
We'll play excerpts of the parliamentary hearing and speak with Sarah Ellison, author of War at the Wall Street Journal, Inside the Struggle to Control an American Business Empire. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations has declared a state of famine in drought-stricken areas of southern Somalia amidst one of the worst humanitarian crises of the past half-century. Half of Somalia's 3.7 million people are said to be in a state of crisis, the vast majority in the south. The UN's humanitarian coordinator for Somalia, Mark Bowden, said the crisis will likely worsen.
I can confirm that this assessment highlights the shocking severity of the crisis facing millions of people in Somalia at the moment. More specifically, the analysis that has been undertaken confirms that a state of famine exists in parts of Bakool and Lower Shabelle regions of southern Somalia. The rest of southern Somalia is close to famine conditions, and it is likely that conditions will deteriorate further in the next month.
The UN says acute malnutrition has reached 30% in Bakool and Lower Shabelle, with some areas seeing malnutrition rates of 50% for children under 5. At least 500,000 children are at risk of death in the Horn of Africa, which has been devastated by high food prices, violence, and the driest conditions in decades. David Catrud of the World Food Programme said aid groups are struggling to reach those in need now that the militant group Al-Shabaab has lifted a ban on foreign organizations.
We're facing an alarming humanitarian situation in central and southern Somalia right now, which is an area we've had limited access since last year. Amongst this, the effects of this are refugees streaming across the border from the effects of drought, high food prices, and violence, and moving into the camps in Ethiopia and Kenya. And amongst this group, we find a high level of malnutrition. Rates of acute malnutrition among children are something to 1 in 2 in the camps in Ethiopia and 1 in 3 in the camps in Kenya.
Overall, the United Nations says it needs $300 million over the next 2 months to assist some 10 million people in need of emergency aid. British Prime Minister David Cameron has appeared before the British Parliament to face questioning over the phone hacking scandal enveloping the Rupert Murdoch media empire and causing an upheaval in British politics. Cameron's appearance comes one day after Murdoch and his son James Murdoch testified for the first time since the scandal blew open earlier this month. Under questioning from British parliamentarian Jim Sheridan, the elder Murdoch refused to accept responsibility for the scandal. Murdoch's testimony was interrupted by a protester who attempted to smear him in the face with a paper plate covered with shaving cream. British Prime Minister David Cameron's appearance today follows new revelations surrounding his government's ties to Murdoch's media conglomerate News International. Cameron's Conservative Party has now acknowledged former Murdoch executive Neil Wallace may have given Cameron's former communications director unpaid advice before last year's election. Andy Coulson, who also previously worked at News International, was arrested earlier this month. A new parliamentary committee report, meanwhile, says Rupert Murdoch's News International newspaper business deliberately tried to block a police investigation into hacking by journalists. The FBI is investigating whether employees at Murdoch's U.S.-based News Corp tried to bribe police and hack into the voicemails of people killed in the 9/11 attacks. The families of 9/11 victims have asked to meet with the FBI and top Obama administration officials about the allegations. On Tuesday, Norman Siegel, an attorney for 9/11 family members, spoke out in New York.
We're not at this point accusing anyone, including News Corp, of any wrongdoing, but in view of the apparent hacking in the UK, the question becomes, logically, whether or not any of that happened here in New York or in the United States. And so our aim is to sit down with our government agencies and find out how they're going to investigate.
We'll have more on the Murdoch scandal after headlines. President Obama is touting a bipartisan Senate budget plan to resolve the impasse over raising the federal debt limit before an August 2nd deadline. The so-called Gang of Six senators have proposed immediate savings of $500 billion, an overhaul of Social Security and Medicare, as well as tax changes to generate some $1 trillion in revenue, while Democrats have previously backed raising taxes on wealthy households and corporations. The new bipartisan plan would raise government revenue by eliminating a number of popular tax breaks and deductions, including write-offs for home mortgage interest and employer-provided health benefits. Going further, the plan calls for using those savings to, in fact, lower taxes for the wealthy, with the top individual and corporate tax rates dropping from 25% to 29%, from 35% to 29%. At the White House, President Obama said the plan provides a basis for ongoing talks.
We have a Democratic president and administration that is prepared to sign a tough package that includes both spending cuts, modifications to Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare that would strengthen those systems and allow them to move forward, and would include a revenue component. We now have a bipartisan group of senators who agree with that balanced approach.
Syrian government forces have killed at least 15 people in the city of Homs as part of an ongoing crackdown on protests against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The victims had gathered for the funerals of 10 protesters killed in previous clashes. Syrian forces reportedly chased fleeing mourners with a tank. Human rights groups estimate at least 1,400 civilians have been killed since the crackdown began over 4 months ago. Passengers on the last ship in the Gaza-bound international flotilla are set for deportation from Israel after their boat was seized at sea. The passengers and crew of the Dignité Al-Karama offered no resistance as Israeli forces took over the vessel and towed it into the Ashdod port. An Israeli Navy admiral acknowledged the activists were peaceful but defended the siege of Gaza.
We know that on this ship there were no arms. But if the naval security blockade will be taken off, we are sure that this line will be used to smuggle weapons into Gaza.
The passengers are still being detained at the port, and supporters are calling for their release. The FBI is claiming Pakistan's ISI spy agency has spent the last 2 decades secretly funneling millions of dollars into U.S. election campaigns and political offices to influence U.S. foreign policy. The allegations are part of a 43-page affidavit filed in connection with the indictment of 2 U.S. citizens. The suspects are Zahir Ahmad, who is in Pakistan, and Syed Fai, who lives in Virginia. Fai directs the Kashmiri American Council, a group that promotes self-determination for Kashmir through lobbying and fundraising efforts. The FBI says the group was largely financed by the ISI and donated as much as $100,000 annually to U.S. political campaigns. U.S. authorities say the bulk of the organization's costs were covered by straw contributors who were subsequently reimbursed by the ISI. The organization's goal was allegedly to influence the U.S. government to push India to allow Kashmir to vote for independence. The FBI has arrested 16 people in a series of nationwide raids targeting two of the world's most well-known hacking organizations. 14 of the suspects were arrested for their alleged links to a December attack on the online payment site PayPal. The loosely affiliated hacker activist group Anonymous took credit for the breach in response to PayPal's suspension of accounts that donated money to the whistleblower website WikiLeaks. An additional suspect was arrested for an anonymous-linked breach of the FBI-affiliated website Infograd. The final suspect was arrested for allegedly lifting files from AT&T's computer system and providing them to Luzsec, a separate hacking group with ties to Anonymous. The suspects were charged with conspiring to intentionally damage protected computers, which is punishable by a maximum of 10 years in prison. The arrest came as Luzsec reportedly breached the computer systems of News International, The Sun, The Times, and The Sunday Times. Voters in Wisconsin have backed a Democratic candidate who faced a recall over his opposition to the state's law stripping public workers of collective bargaining rights. State Senator David Hansen beat out a Republican challenger to retain his seat. Hansen and two other Democrats have been targeted for opposing the law, while 6 Republicans face recall votes for supporting it. The Minnesota legislature has approved a round of budget bills to end the longest government shutdown in state history. The shutdown in Minnesota lasted nearly 3 weeks, resulting in the furlough of over 22,000 state workers. And a grieving African-American mother in Georgia is facing the potential of more time in prison than the drunk driver who struck and killed her child and then fled the scene. Raquel Nelson lost her 4-year-old son while trying to shuttle him across a 5-lane highway along with 2 of her other children. Jerry Guy, a partially blind man who's admitted to having consumed alcohol and painkillers beforehand, hit the young boy with his vehicle. The child later died of his injuries. Nelson and her daughter were also struck and suffered injuries. An all-white jury has convicted Nelson of homicide by vehicle on the 2nd degree, jaywalking, and reckless conduct. She could serve up to 3 years in prison. Meanwhile, the drunk driver, Guy, who was previously convicted of 2 hit-and-runs in one day in 1997, was initially charged with hit-and-run, first-degree homicide by a vehicle and cruelty to children. But the charges were later dropped to simply hit-and-run. Guy served a 6-month jail term and will spend the remainder of his 5-year sentence on probation. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.